The issue of Israel and Palestine has been going on since at least the 1930s, when people who were refugees from Europe, victims of anti Semitism, victims of European anti Semitism, fled the region and came with the assistance of the British Empire to what they thought of as the Holy Land, the area called Palestine. Now, you have to understand that in Palestine, there were Palestinian Muslims, there were Palestinian Christians, and there were Palestinian Jews who had lived there together in the normal harmony of people for a very long time. But European Jews, pushed out by anti Semitism in Europe, now arrived in Palestine and sought land which they were able to get through the British Empire. This created new stresses and strains, and a fight broke out in the 1930s, a rebellion, in fact, of Palestinians against the British Empire and against the new settlers that arrived. Imperialism tipped the hand of the settlers. Part of it was perhaps the deep anti Semitism that wanted Jews to be out of Europe. Don't underestimate the deep roots of anti Semitism in Europe, but also among liberals, guilt for what had been done to European Jews in the Holocaust. That guilt, rather than being handled inside Europe, was in a sense outsourced to Palestine. And in 1948, the state of Israel was created. At the same time, there was a Nakba catastrophe. Palestinians were removed from their homes. It was a great act of ethnic cleansing. And it was, in fact, the foundation of the United Nations. Many of the first United Nations agencies were set up to deal with the problem now of the ethnically cleansed Palestinians who were moved into refugee camps in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt, who were moved into refugee camps in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and so on. Um, Israel was at its foundation in 1948 caught in a contradiction between the desire to create a modern secular state and the desire to create an ethnocratic Jewish state. In fact, the tendencies, the political forces to make Israel an ethnocratic national state, a state of a people, an ethnicity, a religion, and so on, a Jewish state, that was a very strong force. And that political force from 1948 to 1977 eventually triumphs in 1977 when Likud comes to power. Likud has one ambition, which is to create a greater Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. In fact, that slogan, from the river to the sea, is less about anything than a Jewish supremacy, that this land must be Eretz Israel or Greater Israel. And there's been a tendency, not only from before 1948, but it was accelerated after 1977 to expel Palestinians, make life so difficult for the remaining Palestinian Christians, Palestinian Jews, Armenians, other minority populations, and removed them from what was to be a Jewish supremacist state, the state of Israel. In other words, an ethno national state. That was, in effect, the stated policy of the Israeli government over the years. Of course, the Palestinians fought back, building a group called Al Fatah, then eventually the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They fought back, used all kinds of strategies, civil rights, the armed struggle, and so on. In essence, the Palestinians were defended from 1948 till about 1973 by the Arab armies, the armies of Egypt, the armies of Jordan, the armies of Syria, and to some extent the armies of Lebanon, defended the Palestinians. But after the defeat of the Arab armies in 1973, the tide turned, and Egypt and Jordan decided to have a peace agreement with the Israelis. Syria and Lebanon formally didn't continue armed struggle or military struggle against Israel. So from the end of the 1970s, the Palestinians were on their own. And it was in this context that the Palestinians from Lebanon attempted to maintain the armed struggle. And that's when the Israelis in 1982 invaded Lebanon, allowing the great massacre in Sabra and Shatila that year in Beirut, pushing the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its leader Yasser Arafat to flee Lebanon and go to Tunisia, where they were much more cut off from the Palestinian base in the occupied Palestinian territory, and of course in the refugee camps. Well, it was that isolation, in to some regard, the fall of the Soviet Union, that in a way drove the Palestinian leadership, now struggling for decades, to the negotiating table in Madrid, in Oslo, in Dayton, Ohio, other places, and eventually in 1994, without the Soviets there, without direct contact with the mass of the people, and cut off from the first Intifada of 1987, when the people inside the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in the West Bank, rose up. The Palestinian leadership, PLO and others, accepted the Oslo Accords. The Oslo Accords, which Edward Said called the Palestinian Versailles, they gave up, he said. They agreed to something called the two-state solution. They agreed to create something called the State of Palestine. It was to be created in the places invaded and occupied by Israel in the 1967 war. So the three places of East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. The Palestinians had to virtually give up the right to return, enshrined in international law. UN General Assembly Resolution 194 enshrines the right of Palestinians who were victims of the Nakba to come home. That had effectively to be surrendered in Oslo. Equally surrendered in Oslo was that even this small territory, the East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, was to be no longer fully managed by the Palestinians, but the Israelis had control over certain areas. They divided the occupied Palestinian territory into area A, B, and C, different jurisdictions. There was supposed to be safe passage for Palestinians from the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. But as we saw, almost the day after the Oslo Accords were signed, the safe passage idea was thrown into the dustbin by the Israelis. They started to build the apartheid wall around the West Bank, preventing passage to East Jerusalem, and certainly they didn't allow passage to Gaza. Gaza being divided from East Jerusalem and the West Bank by what land the Israelis have, including parts of the Negev desert, the Niqab desert, and so on. So from the next day after the Oslo Accords, the Palestinians found themselves not really able to establish a state. The three parts of the Palestinian state were divided because safe passage was taken away, and the Israelis in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and in Gaza started to take the land back through the creation of illegal settlements built in all three places. This was a very interesting phenomenon. And one has seen the maps to see what was the small territory supposed to be the state of Palestine being eaten up by the settlers. Many of the settlers were Jewish migrants who came from the United States, Canada, Europe, and so on. They were not even from the 1948 lines of Israel. They came from Russia, some of them, after the fall of the Soviet Union, bringing very right-wing ideas about Jewish nationalism and so on. Well, in the period, there was this continued talk of the two-state solution. In fact, it continues even till today. Even though the two-state solution structurally seemed to be impossible, the settlements invalidated contiguity of land in the West Bank, control over resources and so on. Israelis were taking control of water, taking control of the roads, and maintaining these settlements and refusing to move from them. Israel was encroaching upon East Jerusalem, in fact, refusing to allow East Jerusalem to be thought of as part of the state of Palestine, the future state. There was talk of moving the Israeli capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the whole of Jerusalem, not just West Jerusalem, but the whole of Jerusalem, removing perhaps the Armenians from the Armenian quarter, expelling old residents from the old city, threatening the historic Al-Aqsa Mosque, very central to Islam, threatening the Al-Aqsa Mosque because it has contiguity with Jewish areas of worship, claiming that the Al-Aqsa Mosque can be either moved or need not be, so sacred and so on. Very, very provocative things, which provoked the Second Intifada when Ariel Sharon goes to the Al-Aqsa area, the Temple Mount area, very much in a show of force, provoking an intifada, the Second Intifada. In consequence to the Second Intifada, when the Israelis began to arrest all political factions, particularly the left, almost the entire Politburo and Central Committee of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine were in administrative detention in Israeli prisons, held hostage by the Israeli state against the possibility of the creation not only of a Palestinian state but of Palestinian politics. Scared by the fact of the Second Intifada, which seemed to be even more intense than the First Intifada of 1987, the Israelis decided that they were going to have elections to give political authority to the people that they hoped would win the election, which was Fatah, sections of the Palestinian Liberation Organization that had become comfortable with the idea of being second partners to the Israelis. With most of the left in prison, with Fatah contesting against, say, Hamas, which was the Islamic resistance movement founded in 1989, very strong in Gaza. The election results showed Hamas winning in Gaza, at which point the Israelis decided to pull out from Gaza but continue the occupation by suffocation, by collectively punishing the people of Gaza for electing Hamas and then punctually bombing Gaza ruthlessly. 2008, 2009, 2010 again, 2012, 2014, routine punctual bombing of Gaza, devastating the infrastructure to punish the Palestinians in Gaza for electing Hamas in a democratic election. This issue started to bubble up. Palestinian politics seemed to be going nowhere. There was the suffocation of Gaza, the periodic bombardment. Survival became the primary issue in the West Bank, increased settlements, increased harassment by Israeli troops, the arrest of activists, people of the left and so on, held in administrative detention, the encroachment and seizure of East Jerusalem, off the table the right to return. Palestinian politics was at a great low point where it began to seem as if the two-state solution could go nowhere. At that point, activists started to talk about a one-state solution. The possibility that instead of having a one state of Jewish supremacy, which was an apartheid state, everybody else second-class citizens, create a one state which was secular and democratic. It was at this time that outside observers began to say that the Israeli project, in fact, was an apartheid state, because the Israeli project was becoming a one state and it had second-class citizenship for those who were not Jewish. Therefore, the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, Bet Salem, an Israeli human rights organization, Amnesty International, all started to say that Israel is an apartheid state, an apartheid one state. The two-state solution had been invalidated. So activists began to say, what about a one state, which is a state, secular, democratic state of Jews, Muslims, anybody, their religion notwithstanding, and so on. This was out of the question for the right-wing Jewish political parties in Israel, many of them religious parties like Shas and others. But also this was captivating for the right wing, which began to grow its numbers in Israel and become hegemonic. The idea that this was a Jewish state and must always remain so. So saying that the one state is even off the table, one state that is not an apartheid state is off the table, two state is off the table. So what's the solution? Well, there were two solutions. Number one is the three-state solution, which is to remove all Palestinians to Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, the three-state solution. Those who remain inside Israel can be second-class citizens and remain there, but they have to remain as second-class citizens. So one of the solutions was the three-state solution. The other solution was just to say Palestinians can remain, but they're going to have to be second-class citizens. All of them can remain as second-class citizens. This war in Gaza shows that, in fact, the three-state solution is under operation. Israeli officials have been talking about a second Nakba, removing the 2.3 million Palestinians from Gaza and claiming that land, sending those Palestinians to the Sinai desert, making life so difficult in the West Bank. Palestinians decide we're going to go to Jordan or go elsewhere to Australia, but not remain in what will become, these politicians believe, Greater Israel. That's the project right now. It's to create a second Nakba. Terrible bombardment, including of medical facilities and so on. But here's the problem. Palestinians are not moving, and world opinion is shifting away from Israel toward the Palestinians. And increasingly, I believe it will shift towards the only logical outcome for the peoples of that region, which is to learn to build a state in common. A two-state solution cannot happen without safe passage between the three parts of the occupied Palestinian territory. It cannot happen unless settlements are all disbanded, unless the Palestinians are able to have control over their natural resources. Otherwise, it will be merely like a Bantustan, which the South African apartheid regime had tried to create. There is no path right now to a two-state solution. The three-state solution is a war crime. It is a crime against humanity. It is ethnic cleansing. We got to first have a ceasefire in Gaza. That's obviously the first thing. Gaza has to be reconstructed. People have the right to return to their homes. But more than anything, there has to be a big project here, a lot of public pressure against the idea of an ethno-nationalist state, a racist apartheid state. That has to be where this conversation goes. It doesn't end at ceasefire. It has to go beyond that. Thanks so much.